Hello, you're very welcome to this online continuing education event brought to you by the Munster Behaviour Analyst Forum. My name is Alan Tennyson and I'm Secretary of the Forum. We recorded this back in January 21 where we were joined by Dr. Malika Pritchett. And Dr. Pritchett has an article due for publication in a forthcoming issue of Behaviour Analysis in Practice entitled Social Justice is the Aim and Spirit of Applied Science of Human Behaviour. Dr. Pritchett challenges us to reconnect with core concepts in applied behaviour analysis, recognising that at its inception, behaviour analysis sought alternatives to punishment, sought to identify coercion, remove it and replace it with consent. So we were delighted to be joined by her for this challenging and exciting conversation. Okay, I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
I'm sure everybody is feeling the same way. So thank you for inviting me. And we're going to talk today for about 50 minutes. And I'd love for any engagement in the chat, any questions and answers. I'm sure there'll be plenty. So forgive me as I get going in the beginning. I'm going to introduce myself very quickly. And then get to know a little bit about you in the chat, and then we'll be out the gates, and we have a lot of ground to cover. So thank you again for having me. Before I get started, I really like to be sure that I take a step back and acknowledge the fact that there are a lot of people that have conversations about the work that they do, but they sometimes forget to highlight the fact that the work that I'm going to be presenting to you is my dissertation, for example, and no dissertation is an act of just one person's beautiful ideas. There's a lot of people, so I'd like to express my infinite gratitude to my doctoral committee at the University of North Texas who helped this seedling of an idea actually come into what I'm going to be presenting a bit on today. Drs. Alai, Recruz, and Shion, and then some wonderful undergraduate students, Joseph Harris and Melody Jones, who donated their entire summer, one of their summers, to helping me collect all of the data for this project. So really, really important for me to not jump out of the gates and try and have a conversation about some of the work that has my name on it as first author, but also acknowledging that this work is very complicated and there's a lot of people that have helped me, and I have a wonderful community of people helping me going through this. So one of the things that I'd like for everyone to know is that the name of the manuscript is down here at the bottom if you'd like to read the manuscript, and I know Alan provided the link also. So just keep in mind that everything I'm going to be talking about, with the exception of a few new things, is all in that manuscript, so you'll have it in writing in case you want to go back and take a look. The last thing I'll say is that the labor of this type of work, the labor of work that is human rights, is very difficult. And I'd like to acknowledge the fact that the work is difficult and the work is emotionally exhausting. Sometimes when you're engaging in scientific work or clinical practice, you don't find yourself as emotionally exhausted because there's not the weight of the world on your shoulders when you're engaging in the research that you're engaging in. And so I'd like to reach out and tell everybody, I like to tell everybody that I give talks to, that it's important to develop a community of practice, and that the communities that you're working in develop a shared set of values and a shared set of common interests, because those people that you're engaging with regularly as behavior analysts are part of a community practice, and you should be ideally holding each other responsible and accountable for the work you do. So I'd like to get started and just ask people to engage me in the chat, and I'll pause and be quiet for a few seconds and just tell me, who are you? What's the first response, and how could you put into writing in the chat, who are you? And I don't see anything in the chat. Maybe, am I missing something?
Nothing yet. They're too shy.
Oh, that's okay.
Here we come.
Okay.
So, will I read them out as they come up?
I'll look at them and.
Oh, okay. Okay.
it seems like an easy question, but then you get a little stuck. So yeah, good. Early intervention, BCBA, looking to improve quality of life. That's great. Very cool. Children with challenging behaviors, adult services, BCBA training, wonderful. National University of Ireland and Switzerland, wonderful. Great. And also one of the things that gets talked about is the work that we do, but then also who we identify as a person, race, ethnicity, sex, gender, that becomes part of the conversation too. So the next question I have, and then I promise you can take a break and just sit back and relax after this next question. So then if I ask you a question and I say, who are you? But then I give you a caveat and I give you a little bit more context and I say, describe yourself with regard to your behaviors. I've been flirting with the idea of behavior being part of our identity. So if behavior is part of your identity, the things that you do are part of who you are, perhaps as a philosophical way of having that conversation. So now answer the question again, if you would humor me one more time and answer the question again. Now I want to know what it is that you do. How would someone identify you? What are the things you commonly do? I'm commonly in the situation where I am mothering, I am wifing, I am researching, I am exercising on a good day when I've done all the things that I need to do. I'm walking my dogs. So what are the things that you do that are part of your identity? Looking after family, teaching and eating. Yes, that's one of my favorite activities. Gardening and cycling. Very nice. Good. Walking and reading is nice. Exercising, socializing, weight training. Beautiful. Watching TV, cycling, walking. Very cool. Socializing and parenting and researching and clinical work. Absolutely. Ooh, occasionally surfing. I like that. I haven't been able to try. So thank you all for humoring me. The next part of this conversation is about, and telling me who you are and some of the things that you like to do. The next part of this conversation is about considering human behavior as everything that we do. We know that as behavior analysts. And what human behavior offers us is it offers us a unique perspective on what the human condition is. And when you think about the human condition, if you think about the human condition and you look at it from a set of responses, then what gets missed is the humanness and the humanity that comes along with behavior. So everything that we do and all of the things that we identify as important to us is something that is deserving of dignity and it's deserving of love. And so Thomas Gilbert is a behavior analyst, and he talked about the vantage point of love and the importance of approaching all behavior and approaching the way that we understand, talk about, and seek to help people change behavior from this vantage point of love. Because if we don't approach all behavior from this vantage point of love, then what happens is that we tend to overvalue or put too much emphasis on sets of topographical responses and not genuinely being interested in the behavior as a part of the human condition, a part of the human condition that we can see. And so what he says is in love, it's behavior that we value, and behavior can become so valuable to us that it becomes priceless. And I really like starting from the vantage point of love because it gives us, again, like I said, the ability to see that behavior is a part of the human condition and it deserves to be cherished. And from the vantage point of love, Gilbert says that we're propelled by an animating force that centers our actions as behavior analysts And it centers our actions with compassion and care. So if we don't approach behavior from the vantage point of love, then what we're going to be doing is we're going to become or one of the limitations or one of the pitfalls is that we could become hyper focused on these responses, these topographies, and these acts, and just changing all of those things instead of understanding that the intersection that you meet this person is a wonderful opportunity to see who they are and treat who they are and what they do with equal amounts of dignity and respect. So when we consider this vantage point and when we move on, we can't talk about behavior without talking about the environmental context. So we're constantly talking about these behavior-environmental relations. And in behavior analysis, we're seeking to understand the phenomena that is human behavior when we're working with humans, and we shift our attention toward the outward environment when seeking to understand what's going on with behavior. That said, the social environment is highly contextual and filled with many, many different systems of contingencies. And oftentimes, especially with persons with disabilities, all of these contingencies, or most of these contingencies in a large part, are arranged by other people outside of this person. And so it reminded me of this important connection between behavior and environment that is inextricable. And so this person doesn't act upon the world's acting upon them. And so that's a really nice reminder, in my opinion, from Skinner to keep in mind that there's more going on with this context, and these interactions between humans and their environment are dynamic and ever-changing. There's a few scholars that have talked about this dynamic between people behaving or communities engaging in different types of sets of responses and cultures evolving, and talking about that with relation to not only the environment, but the entire interconnectedness of all the people across the globe. And so this concept of oneness of humanity talks about humanity being united and interdependent in dynamic ways. And this human species and environment relationship is characterized by not only individual evolution, but this collective evolution across the planet. So in addition to understanding this interconnectedness of all human species, then we have another conversation, or we engage that conversation at a deeper level and say that if we don't recognize humanity's commonality and their oneness and their interconnectedness, then we are going to be in a situation where we may not be working to harmonize and coordinate any sort of efforts, and human rights efforts being a considerable conversation with regard to the work that we do as behavior analysts, but then all of the work that's happening across the world at all times. So from this vantage point of love, then we have this acknowledgement that all behavior is lawful and determined, as we understand as behavior analysts. So all of these histories of learning are interconnected, and all of the persons within that we are continuing to interact with are united across the globe. And so that zooms the conversation out and brings us to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations, and their assertion in 1948, which was the first assertion of the United Nations at the time, that said that the rights and freedoms of all human beings are to be protected, and that human life is to be universally cherished and valued. So these common themes are around reverence for human life, like we got started in the beginning talking about, and that human life is sacred. Human life should be universally cherished and valued. But what that doesn't offer us, and what it still begs questions, especially what's going on in our world in many contexts, and especially the United States where I'm currently living, is that we don't have much conversation, and we don't beg the question often enough with how do we value human life, who determines value, and how does the research that we conduct as behavior analysts, how does the clinical practice that we engage in as behavior analysts, how does it enhance human life, or worse, does it diminish human life? Which one of these things are we doing, or are we teetering between both? So especially in the context of the United States, it doesn't take much time for people to realize or come to the understanding and the somber acknowledgement that some members of our society, in the US in particular, are suffering more than others. What has shed the most light on this conversation has been the Black Lives Matters movement, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, so much so that communities are calling these two isolated incidents, if you will, they're calling them converging pandemics, especially on behalf of the way in which the pandemic is influencing the Black community here in the United States. So when we think about this disproportionate suffering, we as behavior analysts are in a position in which, as we'll have this conversation a little bit in the future in a few slides, but we're simultaneously, as behavior analysts, operating under the contingencies that are happening with regard to society and being members of a society, but then we're also operating under contingencies that are related to what it means to be a behavior analyst and to do clinical work or to do behavior analytic research. So since we're members of these social systems within which we conduct research, we're in what Israel Golddiamond calls, we are in a scientist as double agent, or in the middle position, in the sense that behavior analysts are engaging in work that's dedicated to the improvement of the human condition at the individual level with our clients and our research participants, but then we're simultaneously operating under contingencies in place in the social systems within which we operate, and that we cannot pretend like both of those sets of contingencies aren't operating at all times. So to give a little bit of an example from what's going on here in the United States and how different organizations are reacting to the systemic racism happening in the country and how that's impacting health in particular, we've got a couple examples for you. Example number one is that the American Medical Association here in the US has declared racism a public threat and put out a statement opposing it in all forms, and has said that racism negatively exacerbates health inequities among marginalized communities, and the American Medical Association acknowledges that without systemic structural changes, these health inequities will continue, and the overall health of our nation is going to continue to suffer. So one call to action in November of last year, just yesterday, the American Psychiatric Association stepped in and said that they are beginning a process of making amends for the direct and indirect acts of racism that have happened in psychiatry. And they've written a specific apology to the Black, Indigenous, and people of color and for its support of structural racism in psychiatry. So these are a couple of examples in which the persons that are providing said services, the persons that are practicing psychiatry, the persons that are practicing medicine are being in a situation where they are duly obligated, not only to the individual patient that they're working with, but then also to understanding and recognizing the societal and systemic pressures that cause this disproportionate suffering to continue. And so it can't be ignored. And some disciplines, medicine seems to be doing a better job than others, but those are just a couple of examples for calls to action. So in our manuscript, we put a bit of a call to action to the field of behavior analysis. And for the most part, some of this conversation was related to the recent events with the murders of persons like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in our country. But these events were not something that started this conversation. The conversation and the passion for this dissertation had already been going along. It just so happened that the tone of this manuscript changed considerably because of what was happening in society as we were writing. And so one of the biggest calls to action was, our world is in crisis and the science of behavior may be able to leverage some change. And one of the ways in which my co-authors and I decided to approach this change was to engage in acts of self-reflection first. And these acts of self-reflection in particular were to reevaluate what we understood as what we're doing as behavior analysts and ask ourselves why, and then look to figuring out if we're doing the job that we're setting out to do or if we're failing, and to what extent if we're failing, and how to adjust our practices and adjust the way in which we engage in scientific work to ensure that we're not, at least as behavior analysts, contributing to these ills of society. So as promised, I wanted to have a conversation about what we called the applied spirit of behavior analysis. And we decided to have this conversation about the applied spirit, especially because as we were teaching behavior analysts and as we were teaching people that were interested in becoming BCBAs and interested in conducting research, we were constantly asking them what applied meant to them. And we got the knee-jerk reaction and the typical social significance conversation, but there wasn't enough of an elaboration of that conversation, and there wasn't enough highlighting on what socially significant really meant. So we decided to take more time to unpack not only the work that Behaviour et al. Did in 1968 to introduce applied behavior analysis to the community, but also to talk about the fact that the applied spirit and what applied really means is that we're addressing societal concerns. And these societal concerns are determined by the interest in which society shows to the problem. So we're a responsive discipline. We're designed to be responsive to whatever is happening and whatever suffering is being brought to the forefront as far as the communities that we're engaging in our work in. In addition, we have this dual responsibility to both participant and society. Gold Diamond introduced that conversation in 1978 and then revisited it in 1984, in that we are dedicated to improving the human condition while operating under these social systems of contingencies. And then lastly, Steve Fawcett in 1991 added to the conversation about what applied really means and says that we should be focused on addressing suffering experienced by members of society who are marginalized, and that is done in a multifaceted way and engages the community through a prevention of suffering to begin with, building capacity and building skills so that the community can continue to fortify themselves and continue on this work without the presence of the behavior analyst, ideally, once the behavior analyst departs. And then empowerment of the community, and that we are developing repertoires, developing skills to ensure that this person is able to take hold of their life as best they can and see it through to what they view as their ideal outcome as far as their life is concerned. So again, if we understand the applied spirit of the science, and we all agree what applied really means in front of the behavior analysis, then our approach in this manuscript to figuring out how well we're doing, to speak loosely, is to do an intentional examination of our research practices. And what we sought out to do was critically examine our research processes and engage in systematic changes in our science, instead of topographical changes that don't lead to any systemic benefit for anybody. We're championing for functional changes in these systems. And by functional changes, I mean that we're challenging systemic injustices if and when we see them. And we're creating a paradigm shift in science and the practice of behavior analysis to ensure that we have a critical examination of these research processes in the context of what it means to ensure that human rights are being upheld in behavior analysis, research, and practice. So a behavior analyst in 1978 named Holland made a point about the fact that if we're talking about relieving suffering and we're concerned about improving the quality of human life, then if the people of society are unhappy, then it's the contingencies embedded in the institutions, in the economic system, and in the government which change. So this took the conversation from an individual level and up to a systemic level as behavior analysts, and forced us to do an examination of functional analysis of the different contingencies operating in our societies that continue to perpetuate this systems of oppression, which are typically going to be guided through Sidman's conversation about coercion and control, and coercive control in particular. Sidman and Skinner's conversations about this. So at the bottom line, in order to investigate and change systems of contingencies that devalue and potentially harm research participants, we have to first examine the system. So to give an example of a system that did not serve persons with regard to biomedical research, not necessarily behavioral research in the United States, then we've found that there's been crimes against humanity that have occurred under the guise of biomedical research in particular. So one of the illustrations that I'll talk about briefly is the Tuskegee syphilis study. And in context, one of the conversations has to be about why the burdens of research had been disproportionately endured by certain persons who didn't have the opportunity or the luxury, if you will, to not participate in research. So in the Tuskegee syphilis study in Alabama in the United States, essentially a study was allowed to continue for 40 years, and the Black sharecroppers at the time were majorly unable to read, were forced to work at sharecropping jobs. This is post-slavery, and then not given enough information about why they were being signed up for an experiment. And essentially they were told that they were being treated for what was called bad blood at the time. So syphilis was on the rise. It was continuing to happen in this community and in many, many others. And they were told that they were going to be treated for bad blood, and they were given various incentives like meals, burial stipends for when they did pass away, and transportation to and from these sites so that they could participate in these studies. They were completely unaware of what the purpose of the study was, and the purpose of the study was to see what syphilis did to a human body after they had passed. So it was planned in this study, and the study was designed so that these Black male sharecroppers were not going to be given information about what the study was about. And despite the fact that through this study they found a cure for syphilis about halfway through, the participants were not given the treatment for syphilis, because again, the point of the entire entire research endeavor was to see what happened to the men after they died. So they are waiting for them to die to get that information. So because of this outcry, the United States took out a special committee, the National Committee, to have conversations about human rights in particular, and what the minimum human rights would be for biomedical and behavioral research, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But because of this outcry, we ended up with the Belmont Report in the late 1970s here in the US. So another part of this conversation, when we're looking at societal structures and we're trying to understand why certain persons would be selected for research over others, and what's motivating the research agenda in particular, there's been conversations about the fact that science in particular still bears the fingerprints of colonialism, as you see this article written by Deb Roy in the Smithsonian Magazine in 2018. And essentially this commentary that's been woven throughout different disciplines has been turning a critical eye to medicine and science in particular, and in encouraging people to understand that science and medicine were not inextricable from the entire efforts that come from Europeans conquering other parts of the world. And so modern Western science, as Deb Roy says, is inextricably entangled with colonialism, especially British imperialism, and that these colonial legacies continue to shape trends in science today. So when we talk about why science is progressing and how science is progressing from this point, we have a concept that's been given to us by Anibal Quijano. And in 2000, he coined a term called coloniality of power. And what he says coloniality of power is, to put it in a very short, succinct point in time for today, is that what has happened is that these colonial practices are what he calls aftermaths of colonialism. And so these aftermaths of colonialism have to do with who gets treatment, who gets selected for research and treatment, who has to bear the burdens of research, how that information gets taken and then given to persons who don't have to participate in the research endeavor themselves. So that's how we see coloniality of power reflected in medicine and science, but then also there's conversations about coloniality of power and how that has fundamentally changed what artwork is considered beautiful and so on and so forth. So as applied behavior analysts, we have to understand and come to a consensus in saying that the science of applied behavior analysis was developed within a Western hegemonic structure. And so everything we do as scientists of human behavior in the Skinnerian sense is dominated by these Western orientations. And at times we need to be considering and wondering if these coercive practices serve to dominate and control different members of society are showing up in the work that we do as behavior analysts. So to give a little bit of more context, it's important, I think, to keep in mind that this cycle of coercion has been talked about in behavior analysis. This is not a new conversation. It's just a conversation that's being elevated at this moment to the level of what it means to be Eurocentric and Western dominated in the sense of where our field came from. So again, this cycle of coercion is brought from the works of Del Prato in 2002, Skinner, of course, in 53, and Sidman in 2001, most recently, but 1989, I believe Coercion and Its Fallout was published first. And so what you have is you have this conversation about control as far as the behavior environment relation is concerned. But if you are in a situation where you have a controller and a controllee, then if a person is in this position of coercion, then what you're going to have is you're going to have a reaction that is counter control. A person doesn't want, loosely speaking, to be in a situation where they are being coerced into behaving in specific ways. And so what you get as a response is counter control. And then the controller has another response, which is counter control. So this constant dynamic and this cycle of coercion is one that behavior analysts have had many conversations about, especially when we're talking about punishment and negative reinforcement. So if we're talking about punishment and negative reinforcement as basic behavior principles, then coercion is part of that conversation logically. So to take a one step aside, I'd like to give a little bit of a backstory about a person whose life is very important to ours. In this very moment, especially in the middle of a pandemic, Miss Henrietta Lacks, who was born in 1920 here in the States and passed in 1951. In her story, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, told by Miss Rebecca Skloot, she talks about Henrietta and explains that she is a Black woman born of slavery and sharecropping who fled to the north of the United States for prosperity, only to have her cells used as tools by white scientists without her consent. So basically the story is that Miss Lacks went to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. She was in tremendous pain, a Black woman, had very, very little options for treatment at that time, and in 1951, and was seeking physician assistance because she had discovered that there was a hard mass on her cervix. So her options for treatment were limited to this subpar and segregated Black ward of Johns Hopkins. And it was there that physicians scraped cells from her cervix for pathology testing to see if there was a malignancy to the mass and make recommendations for her treatment. Well, her cells were sent to the lab to determine if there was any malignancy, but then also some of her cells were sent to a research lab in the hospital for a gentleman that was interested in conducting work on cells. And typically, this had to happen because many, many human cells had to be taken from patients for the purpose of research, because at that time, cells only lived for a short period of time, so the research process was restricted temporally. But as a result of Henrietta's cells, it turns out that when they arrived to the laboratory, they didn't die like other cells had done, but instead they multiplied rapidly, which made the scientists call her cells immortal. Unfortunately, Miss Lax died of cervical cancer 9 months later and in poverty, but her cells are called HeLa cells because of her first and last initials of her name, first and last name. And her HeLa cells continue to be harvested and distributed by the trillions in research labs across the world. For example, they were the first to be shipped by mail. They were first to be cloned and sent to outer space. Her cells have given us breakthroughs such as the polio vaccine and in vitro fertilization. And today, HeLa cells are pivotal and continue to be pivotal in this research with regard to a COVID-19 pandemic. So very, very interesting conversations when we think about the human cost of biomedical and behavioral research and who gets to profit. Unfortunately, her family and Miss Lax never saw any of the profits from any of the work that were done with her cells and continue to be done with her cells, sadly. So the last bit I'd like to spend some time on is what happens when there are legitimate concerns with regard to how biomedical or behavioral research is conducted. So the Belmont report provided a minimum standard for scientists and medical professionals and said, at absolute minimum, if you are going to be working with human participants, then the principle of respect for persons says that you need to have consent. The person needs to voluntarily participate in this research endeavor, and then assent needs to be part of that conversation as well. Consent for a person that has the capacity to decide whether or not they want to take place in research or clinical practice in the work that we do, but then assent meaning that if a person is not of age or not legally an adult, such as children, then children or adolescents, then assent meaning that they can be signed up for the research endeavor by their parents, but at any point in time, if they become uncomfortable, then the researcher honors their wishes to leave the research context. The next conversation is about beneficence, in the sense that if a person is engaging in any sort of medical or scientific endeavor, that there should be a benefit to them at the outset of that research endeavor. They should have an improvement in their life, and there should be socially valid and meaningful outcomes that help them to say, by participating in this research, I have experienced an improvement of my quality of life on the other end of it. And so the last principle is justice, in that we are valuing the identities of the person. In particular, we're talking about making sure that there is not an over-reliance of choosing people to engage in research endeavors if they cannot escape from the research endeavor altogether, or in the context of applied behavior analysis, if applied behavior analysis, the only way they're going to be able to come in contact with a behavior analyst is through participating in a research endeavor, that's a concern. We also want to be sure that there's not an over-reliance on certain populations. So the question for behavior analysts is, are we only working with a certain race? Are we only doing research with a certain ethnicity? Are we only doing research with people with developmental or intellectual disabilities? Are we only doing research in contexts where people are likely to be of low income and not likely to be able to afford services? So is there an over-reliance on people who can't escape or don't have the ability to advocate for themselves? Are we over-relying on those people to conduct our research? So those are all of the broader questions and genuine concerns. So I'll fast forward to one of the other concerns, and then we'll tie this all up so that we can have a nice discussion together. But one of the conversations that my colleagues and I were having was, if we take this understanding of why the research endeavor is happening, or take this understanding of why we're engaging in clinical practice, one of the conversations that Steve Fawcett had was, he was having a conversation about what colonial relationships are. And essentially what he said in 1991 is that a colonial relationship in the context of applied behavior analytic services is one in which you invite the person to participate in this research endeavor, but it's a relationship that is not two-sided, if you will, that the researcher has their agenda, the researcher has decided what they are going to study, and then the relationship is cultivated just so that they can participate in this endeavor. So the next part of the conversation was extended by my co-authors and I, and said, well, we don't think it stops at a colonial relationship. We also think that this process of taking data is an interesting process, because what data is data is a numerical representation of a person's human condition and what they're doing at that moment. And what we do is we take that precious, we're coming from the vantage point of love yet again, we're taking this precious information, this numerical quantification of a person's existence, and then what we're doing is we're translating that into data, numbers, and graphs, and then what happens on the other end of it is it gets exchanged for typically money, tenure for professors, fame in publications, and on and on. So that's one of the constructs that we're constantly thinking about and worried about. And the last thing that I'll end with is a conversation about how to shift this paradigm like we talked about. So doing a good look at if we're engaging in colonial research practices or colonial practices in our clinical work, and how to move towards more participatory research practices as the other end of the continuum, so that we can safeguard against these horrific things that we've seen in the past, and we don't continue those into the future, but that we promote inclusion of communities, amplify the voices of people that we're working with, and we prevent this exploitation and further marginalization. So the bottom line is that we're championing for developing collaborative relationships, that our dependent variables are socially valid. We're not just changing different responses just because we're changing them. There needs to be a direct benefit to the person's quality of life, and that these skills that we teach can generalize and maintain outside of the context of research, that there's maintenance with regard to interventions, that we're not in a situation where the intervention only works when the behavior analyst is there, and then once the behavior analyst leaves, everything goes back to the way it was, that we're ensuring that there's a continued benefit after the researcher leaves, and then that there's the entire part of this is valuing the context in which each person lives and the community in which they live, and improving their empowerment and their ability to participate in their world and in their community as best they want. So the last thing I'll leave you with is a nice quote from Dr. Ruha Benjamin, and she talks about this work that we're doing and the society in which we're living, and says, remember to imagine and craft the worlds we cannot live without, just as you dismantle the ones that you cannot live within, which I find very comforting, especially living in the United States at this point in time on such a day which feels like every day we're living a different page in a history book. So thank you for your time. I'm going to stop sharing and then be quiet so that other people can talk and interact.
Thanks so much for that, Malika. At the beginning, I neglected to mention that evidently your paper, The Aim and Spirit of an Applied Science, was published. It's forthcoming issue of Behavior Analysis in Practice, and it's a special issue that's been brought forward to address systemic racism. Isn't that right?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. I understood that. And then you spoke about the Tuskegee experiment and how that led on to the Belmarsh report. Isn't that right? And then within your paper, you take the principles that are contained in the Belmarsh report and you look at the behavior analytic literature to see how it measures up against that. So what were your kind of main findings? Could you say a little bit about that?
Sure. So the main findings that we found was that there was very little report of consent for behavior analytic literature. We looked at the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. We sampled the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis for the first 50 years, so 1968 through 2018. And so there's very limited report of consent. There's very limited report that the dependent variables that were selected for measure were actually valuable to the participant. We're seeing a lot of changing of responses that can be considered very not functional responses. So for example, putting a poker chip into a can, or learning to understand different symbols in different languages like Gaelic, or not symbols in different languages rather, but different words in different languages. And I think Japanese was another example. So, but these participants were English speaking from what we understood. And so these skills were not necessarily going to be part of a constellation of skills that would help them in their everyday lives. And one of the most startling things that we revealed was that from a justice perspective, there's very little information about the age, the sex, the gender, the race, the ethnicity, the religion, all of these things that make up a person. We don't collect that information as behavior analysts well at all. And if we are collecting it, it's not being reported. So one of the most glaring concerns we had was we're starting to become worried, and now we're going to be doing more investigation on, is behavior analytic research, number one, primarily based off of a community of people that are particularly vulnerable? So do we have an over-reliance on investigating challenging behaviors with people that are underserved and historically from marginalized communities? And then are we doing a whole nother set of research on just skill acquisition and improving skills on a whole nother segment of society, people that are probably more affluent, more able to access different services, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So those were the glaring concerns.
And I suppose you look at a period of time beginning in, my question would be, are we getting better or worse? We would hope we're getting better. They say the arc is what the arc of history bends towards justice, but is that true in what you found?
It seems like when applied behavior analysis started its research line, starting in 1968, we saw a lot of good conversations. 1968 all the way up until about the mid 80s, we saw a lot of good conversations about what's important to this community, where is the behavior analyst living and working and doing research, and what's the concerns of the community, and that being what brought the conversation to bear. Once we got to the functional analysis literature, Iwata, I hope I don't misquote, 84, is that too, might be too far back, it might be 94. But once we got to this functional analysis literature, it might be 94.
I think it's 94, yeah.
Thank you. Then we see we see a considerable shift, and we see a considerable change in motivation and what we're reporting about the participants in particular. That was really glaring to us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another thing that I found like a little bit shocking, if I'm honest, was the story you told, it's contained within the paper in the discussion, I believe, about the Icantina. Do I have the names right? It seems like quite a level of disregard for the participants of a study that I would have hoped wouldn't have happened with our discipline, but could you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So, of course, Ike and Tina Turner, these pop icons, and people that the Black community, especially with regard to music, were very fond of and very found very relatable in a lot of different ways, but then also this very sad underside to their relationship, which was fueled with drugs and physical violence in their marriage. So Ike and Tina being part of the Black community in that way, but then everybody knowing how horrific their personal lives were outside of music, is another conversation, especially when it comes to talking about celebrities. So it was very shocking to us because we saw not only did this research article, not only did they not give us very much information, they basically said, we've got some teenagers, they engage in really challenging behaviors. Both of them were physically aggressive. One was a female, the other was a male, as they reported, and they were both Black, and they came into our clinic because we were going to do a functional analysis on why the function of these challenging behaviors, and eventually develop a treatment program on the other side of it. When you're naming participants, you would like to potentially maybe give them the option to name themselves in the research context so that you can protect their true identities. But it was flooring to me as a Black woman to think that some behavior analyst was conducting this research and thought it was okay to call these participants, one of them Ike and the other one Tina, because they were Black and physically aggressive. It just propelled a stereotype. I could tell you to this day exactly where I was in space and time when I read that, sitting in the library by myself doing my research. And I was just shocked because I was going into this research endeavor, doing the work that behavior analysts do and doing this inductive type of research, not coming up with any theories and then trying to prove it along the way, but just collecting my data and scoring all of these articles and reading them 3 times over to make sure the scoring was right, and on and on. And so that was really a kick in the stomach for me personally as a Black woman, but then also professionally, knowing that I'm part of a system that has made a mockery out of some participants and their condition being physically aggressive. That's why they're there. They shouldn't be mocked for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And feel free to put in any chat if anyone has any questions. We're running up against the clock. It always goes very quickly, the time, of course. What would you like to see happen? Where solutions? Yeah. Consent and reporting it, being part of the peer review process. Sorry to put words in your mouth, but that was in the paper, wasn't it? Yes, yeah. At a minimum.
Yeah, I'd like for these minimum standards to exist in our publication, and I'd like for us to start engaging in proactive and preventative ways. We prevent these things from happening. We don't wait for bad things to happen and then try and patch it up. We see through the lens of medicine. We see through the lens of psychiatry, and we see through the lens of our allied disciplines that perhaps have been around. Our science is still very young, but it doesn't mean we have to make all these mistakes. It seems like we can prevent a lot of this just by reporting this information.
And evidently it's very challenging to a community that historically has relied on people with developmental disabilities, including autism, to have to acknowledge that maybe our science has grown because they were a historically underserved community. And I mean, your story about the man and the others, a question come in there, but really great to consider this perspective. Very shocking, but insightful. Thanks very much, Rory. Now, I should say as well, before we finish up, tonight's keyword is going to be Henrietta. I've posted that in the chat. So if you need a CEU certificate for this, you'll receive an email after the event, and Henrietta is the keyword. That's HENRIETT. That's an absolutely amazing book. If anyone is interested, it's available in the Irish library system. I got it out of the library. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and it's such an eye-opener in terms of how people have been used and continue to be used in research. It gave me a lot of food for thought. So thanks so much. It's a real pleasure speaking to you, and I hope to see you in Ireland.
I know. I'm ready. Soon.
Yeah. In the meantime, online gives us an opportunity to do this kind of thing. So thanks
Yes.
so much as well to everyone else for coming, and we'll finish up there then. So
yeah, okay.